send me where he bought his in California.
Yeah, there's a place, and I've been on that website. It's really good.
He told me not to get A's either. He told me buy B's, grade B for everything we buy. Because he said A's, the only difference between A's and B's are there may be a scratch on the case of the B's, but they're the same solar panels as the A's, and you'll get them for half the price.
That's what I read
I
in these because they're not
bugs
heavy.
me one time.
And then they have thin socks
Been to
on.
California,
I'm gonna have to get in the habit of wearing that.
And he was going to send me a website and all the ones he got. And he said what we'd have to do is for us, we need to get the inverter, of course. But then you got to get the thing that goes, the kill switch that goes on the box, because you have to have it.
I went
But
out
he said it'll feed back into
just
the
pull off.
the
I was
system.
like,
So, I think he told me it was probably looking less than $1,000.
right.
Maybe
Yeah.
1,500
And I
to
said,
do all of it.
I know
And
this
we'll
is
break,
not my budget.
I figure we can save our money in a year with what we're paying in electricity.
To me, in my body. I mean, it has nothing to do with either one. I'm eating perfect, so I know
Maybe 2
there's
years
no
and
extra
it'll be
anything.
great.
But yeah, I work any and out, any little work at all that I do.
It could still be.
Like he told me, he says we should be able
I
to.
mean,
control
you're
that.
past menopause, but it still could be horrible.
Thursday or
It
Friday.
could be, but I was having problems, with my blood sugar rising. I went off my diet, and we went on vacation, and my doctor said, well, I want you to try red again sometime.
I say that, or I was going to talk
I
to
have a hard
Brandon,
time.
about when the brother-in-law.
Oh, we're done, right?
You're right.
Right, that's me too.
I can't do that.
Yeah,
Red is my biggest, and I think
said, that's what he said we could do, is he said, use my same bracket system, so go back and watch the video that he made his, that are on the ground, they're not really on the ground, but they're up on the ground, but they're on the ground. He said, follow that same set, and he said the best part, you could see the set, if you could tie them in over here, but then make it where they could come off, if you had people who were using your RV hookups, and make it where they can use them to charge their stuff.
We'll try that out, bro, that's all
time to begin. Let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Father in heaven, we come before you at this time just thanking you for another day that we get to come together in fellowship, and pray that our time together in study today might be edifying and glorifying to you. Just continue to be with those that are on our prayer list that are struggling or have any other need at this time, and just help us to be of encouragement. All right, let's open up to Genesis chapter 29. That's where we're going to spend our time today. Continuing our study through the book of Genesis. Now in chapter 29, we continue to read the story of a man named Jacob. At this point, he's run away from home. Not run away, I should say, better sent away by his mother, Rebecca. And the main reason for that, as we've talked about, was because his brother Esau was setting out to kill him as a result of Jacob having taken away both his birthright and his blessing. So verse 1 of this chapter, he's already left home, and it says, "Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east." Now this carries with it the idea that after Jacob left home, he eventually ended up in what the text calls this land of the sons of the east. And this was a land that was occupied by a people who lived in a part of the world that was east of the land of Canaan. And we remember Jacob originally lived in Canaan with his father Isaac and mother Rebecca, and obviously Esau, but he's left home. He's now headed east. Now, what we also know about this land where Jacob arrives at is that this is the same land where Rebekah's brother Laban lived. And that's something that will become important as we get further into this chapter. But with that being the case, in verses 2 and 3, the author continues setting a context for us. It says, "He looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it. For from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well." Now, simply put, in these verses, the author is giving a detailed description of where Jacob arrived at when the events of this chapter are set in motion. Now, according to these verses, where Jacob arrived to was a field where flocks of sheep would gather in order to drink water from the well that was in the field. And, of course, the text says that when this well was not in use, it was covered with a large stone. Any questions or comments on these opening verses before we keep moving forward? Okay. So with these things that the author of Genesis has said, this sets the stage for us that for the story he'll go on to tell in verses 4 through 35 of this chapter, where Jacob meets a shepherdess named Rachel, who after a series of events would become Jacob's wife because of Jacob's great love for this woman. So it's these series of events that we're going to examine as we look at a few points that can be gleaned from the text of verses 4 through 35 of this chapter, and what the story that is told is about the relationship that existed between Jacob and this woman Rachel. God has brought them together. But again, this is after a series of events. So the first point we'll see is that Jacob and Rachel, they were relatives. The second point we'll look at is that Jacob married both Rachel and her sister, which is an interesting story in itself. But finally, the third point we'll look at from verses 31 through 35 is that Jacob and Rachel initially could not have children. But after looking at these things, some application we'll take from this is that God does bring certain people into our lives and does so in order to further carry out his will, and the result is praise for God. So we'll take this down in chunks. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 4 through 12, we'll start with the first point.
Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father.
Okay, we'll pause there. Thanks, Dad. So the point, again, we're going to be looking at here is that Jacob and Rachel were relatives, verses 4 through 12. Now, what's the first thing that happens there in verse 4? What's the question that Jacob asked? Where are you from? He just wants to know where these individuals are from. So we're seeing a set of circumstances being set here. It's the circumstances under which Jacob would come to meet Rachel. So these circumstances where Jacob encountered these sons of the east and begins by asking them, as the text says, "Where are you from?" And they say they're from Haran, or Haran, however you pronounce it, I'm not sure. Now, the region, this is the same region from which Jacob's mother Rebekah came, as well as Rebekah's brother Laban. So, next question that Jacob asks there in verse 5 is, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" Now, did you have grandson in verse 5, Dad? I thought I heard you say grandson. That's interesting. Okay, I'm not sure why, because the New American Standard says the son of Nahor. That's odd. Okay. Well, there's clearly something has gone there, but we're not going to get off on that discussion. But the point is that he's asking them if they know Laban. So they respond that they do, and he asks, "Is it well with them?" But the point of emphasis in these verses is that at the time these flocks of sheep are gathered, and we're going clear through just covering verse 8, through verse 8, these sons of the east draw attention to the fact that Laban's daughter Rachel is coming with a flock of sheep, and the context indicates that they belong to her father Laban. Jeremiah, you have your hand up.
The word is not son like we think of son.
So is it grandson?
It is male descendant, and it is literally his grandson.
Okay, so it's a grandson. It's not literally son, but all the same, it's a descendant, is what we can safely say. So, but again, these point of emphasis in verses 4 through 8 is that at the time the flocks of sheep are gathered, these sons of the east draw attention to the fact that Laban's daughter Rachel is coming with a flock of sheep. So, and the context indicates these sheep belong to Rachel's father, Laban. Now, can anyone remind me what Laban's relationship was to Rebekah? They were brother and sister. So Rachel is Laban's daughter. This would basically make Rachel Jacob's cousin. So this is where we begin to see that they were relatives. And this really comes out in verses 9 through 12, where the author of Genesis records what happened between Jacob and Rachel. Now, according to verse 9, what is Rachel's occupation? She's a shepherd. New American Standard has it in the feminine form, shepherdess. So what does a shepherd do? Or shepherdess, however you want to put it. They tend to sheep. So that's what Rachel was involved in. That was her life. Now, context seems to indicate that her specific responsibility was the watering of the sheep. Now, if that's the case, it would be for this reason that the author of Genesis records in verse 10 that upon seeing Rachel, Jacob proceeds to roll the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock. Questions or comments up to this point before we cover verses 11 and 12? I'm not sure how usual or unusual it would be, but families were very tight-knit, so she might have just been doing this to help her father, especially if there was not a male in the household. That's a good question, but that's the best answer I can provide to it. Anything else? So, Jacob has encountered Rachel. What does he do in verse 11? He gave her a kiss. And what else did he do? Lifted up his voice and wept. Now, why would he do this? Why would he do what he does in verse 11? Okay, so that's probably the case. That must have been some kind of surprise, but what seems to be going on here is that Jacob is overjoyed that he's found a relative. So that if that's the case, this kiss, it's not a romantic kind of kiss. It's a kiss that would occur between family members. So with that being the case, the idea of Jacob lifting his voice and weeping, he cried out and shed tears of joy that he had finally found one of his relatives. So in verse 12, Jacob reveals to Rachel that he was a relative of her father, and he was Rebekah's son. So this causes Rachel to run home and tell her father about these things. But this is where we're seeing that they were basically cousins. So at this point in their story, Jacob told Rachel that he was related to her father because he was Rebekah's son. Now what Rachel does here is the same response that Rebekah had in Genesis 24, verse 28. When she met the servant of Abraham, this culminated in her meeting Isaac in that same chapter of Genesis. So with all that being true, the point we should see from verses 4 through 12 concerning the relationship between Jacob and Rachel is that they were relatives. In these verses, the author is establishing the point that there was that family connection. Jacob, he has an emotional reaction to this because he's overjoyed at the fact that he has found one of his relatives that he had never met before this point. Now, Rachel seems to share in this joy because her reaction is to go tell her father Laban about meeting Jacob. That's a lot of information. Any questions or comments before we move on to verses 13 and following? Okay. So this brings us into the second point, verses 13 through 30, the next part of the story. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he related to Laban all these things. Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," and he stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her." Laban gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob went into her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me?" But Laban said, "It is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban also gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. So Jacob married Rachel and her sisters, the point we'll be looking at. So this point is introduced with the author of Genesis recording verses 13 and 14, Laban's reaction to the news concerning Jacob's meeting of Rachel, which results in an invitation for Jacob to stay with Laban for as long as a month. Now, how's Laban reacting to the news of Jacob meeting Rachel? How does he feel about it? He's excited. He's happy. So this is the same reaction we find in Genesis 24 about when Laban hears the news about Rebekah meeting Abraham's servant. So Laban acknowledges Jacob's family connection, and what else does Laban do? In those 2 verses. Brought him to his house, and he invites Jacob to stay with the family for a month. So it's for that reason that beginning in verse 15 and going through verse 20, that the author of Genesis records a conversation between Jacob and Laban. Now, what is Jacob's wanting to do at this point in his relationship with Rachel? Jacob is wanting to marry Rachel. What's the condition? Work for 7 years. That's what Laban asked for. So, in this section, the author is introducing another part of Jacob and Rachel's story, where Jacob would be able to marry Rachel with the condition of serving Laban for 7 years. But what the author is also introducing here is the fact that in addition to Rachel, Laban also had another daughter named Leah. She was the older sister of Rachel, and from the text, she stood in stark contrast to Rachel in terms of her appearance. Now, what does verse 17 tell us about Rachel and Leah? The comparison or contrast between the two. So you have the word delicate there. Right. And it's not a major point, but it's one we have to consider because of translation issues. The word weak, the New American Standard has the word weak, but another rendition of it could be delicate. So what the author is doing here, he's presenting a comparison between the two, but there could also be what we would call a contrast. So he's presenting whatever way you go, there's a difference between the 2 sisters, is what the author is pointing out. He could be comparing the beauty of these 2 sisters. The beauty could be seen in the eyes of Leah, or if he's presenting a contrast, there's a weakness with Leah's eyes, whatever that is. But the point the author is making seems to be that Rachel was the more attractive of the 2 sisters. Questions or comments on that? What is said there in verse 17? Okay. That's true.
You're right. That's,
Like they did nothing else, he's saying there's something wrong.
That seems to be the case.
Even, yeah, if it's just talking about you've got weak eyes, perhaps, even blindness,
Yeah.
that there's something wrong with her, and there's nothing wrong with Rachel.
That seems to be the information that's being presented here. So that's why we can say there's probably a contrast rather than a comparison. So how does Jacob feel about Rachel, according to the text? He loved her. Now, the idea of love is, in the Old Testament, it's more affection and loyalty is the idea attached to it. In the New Testament, it's slightly different. But Jacob loves Rachel. What does he offer to do? Work for 7 years for her. It might be something to do with the dowry, absolutely, especially at this time. But what does verse 20 say? How did Jacob feel about these 7 years? Seemed like just a few days, and that's because of his great love for her. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So here's where we get into the nitty-gritty, verses 21 through 30. Jacob completes his service, but then Laban does something. What does he do? He switches daughters. He gives Leah instead of Rachel. So this is what we're going to talk about a little bit more. So verse 21, it says, Then Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her. So Jacob's making a demand. He's met the condition. He says, Give me my wife. Now, the going into her has to do with the sexual relations. But with that in mind, we should also remember that at this time, similar to today, that those sexual relations were considered to be the consummation of marriage. It's what sealed the deal, so to speak, as a husband and wife. So with that being the case, we go into Laban's deceitful actions. He prepares a wedding feast and gives Leah as his wife, as a wife to Jacob rather than Rachel. Now, in these verses, the author of Genesis is recording that in response to Jacob's demand from verse 21, Laban takes measures to deceive Jacob and give to him Leah instead of Rachel to be his wife. So what Laban is doing here is he's making Jacob think that he was marrying Rachel. And that results in Jacob having relations with Leah as opposed to Rachel, as Jacob desired, as described in verse 23. Now the question comes up, how did Jacob not know that this was Leah instead of Rachel? Okay, that's one possibility. Is there any other possibilities? Veils. That's a strong possibility here. They wore veils, the women did, at this time. And we know this because based on cultural practices of the time, is as Leah was having her relations with Jacob, she was probably still wearing a veil. So Jacob could not immediately recognize who this was. It's a sad set of circumstances. But what this means that even at the time Jacob was consummating the marriage, he would have assumed this was Rachel, and this is if Leah was still wearing the veil at this time. But intoxication could have had something to do with it too. But whatever the case, in verse 25 through 27, the author records it was not until the following morning that Jacob had discovered that this was Leah he had been with. And so he confronts Laban, and what does Laban say to Jacob? That was their custom. So what else does he say? 25 through 27. Absolutely. So these are the details. Now, it is unfair.
To use one of our sayings, the pot calls the kettle black.
Yeah, that's a good expression for this. Oh, man, I drew a blank on that. Jacob and Rebekah deceived Isaac. Absolutely. Maybe. So, but yeah, it's coming back around. We could say that. So, okay. There's a lot of sayings. So Laban demands that Jacob allow Leah to complete her week and then ask for another 7 years of service. Now, one of the first things we should understand here is that this week that Laban is talking about is the wedding celebration would be a week long. This will be a week full of festivities, of a celebration of marriage. But obviously Jacob is angry that Laban has done this, but he still agrees to the terms. And we see that in verse 28 through 30. But anything on verses 25 through 27? Okay. So, going on to verses 28 through 30, the author records Jacob's agreement and of Laban's request, at which point he's given Rachel as his wife, along with the added detail that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and that is why he agrees to serve Laban for another 7 years. Now, at this point, the author of Genesis is simply summarizing what has been recorded since verse 13, and again saying that Jacob agreed to Laban's additional terms. But again, he adds that detail. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Now, again, the word loved, it's a word that in the Old Testament has the idea of affection and loyalty. Applied here, it's this affection and loyalty toward Rachel that would prompt Jacob to agree to 7 more years of service in order to have Rachel as his wife. So putting verses 13 through 30 together, the point we should see concerning the relationship between Jacob and Rachel is that Jacob married Rachel and her sister. Now, in these verses, the author of Genesis is showing that even though his desire was to marry Rachel, Jacob would end up marrying both Rachel and her sister Leah. Now, what the author also shows is that the reason this happened is because Laban deceived Jacob into believing that on the wedding day he was marrying and having relations with Rachel when it was actually Leah. So Jacob would be forced into agreeing into additional terms of marriage, but would do so because of his great love for Rachel. A lot of information. Questions or comments? All right. This brings us into verses 31 through 35. Now, what happens there? We'll read the verses and then we'll discuss them. Again, verse 31, now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, and Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. Then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Now here in verse 31 we see another contrast between Rachel and Leah. What does verse 31 tell us about Rachel and Leah? So that's what the text says. So, yes, implied there is that Rachel was loved, Leah was unloved. Jacob had no affection for Leah. It's a lack of affection and, again, loyalty as well. Being that that's the case, however, the Lord allows Leah to have children. Now, even though Jacob did not have this affection toward Leah, there were still relations and stuff going on between them. But this sets the stage for what the author will record concerning Jacob's son here at the end of chapter 29, but clear through chapter 30. So, with that being the case, in verses 32 through 35, we find a list of 4 sons that would become 4 out of the 12 sons of Jacob. Now, as we come to these verses, one thing we should notice there is how Leah responds to the birth of her sons. Now, what's her attitude? What does she think is going to happen when she has these sons? Okay, and how do we know that from the text? Sandy's correct, but what in the text tells us that? Yeah. So 3 times she says in different words, I'm going to be loved by my husband because I've had these sons. But the exception is in verse 35. How does she respond in verse 35 to the birth of the 4th son? Now I will praise the Lord. So implied in all this is that Jacob doesn't have any more affection for her with the birth of her son. So son number 4, she says, I will praise the Lord. What name does she give the son there in verse 35? Judah. So, what the author, and what else does the author add? What happens after the birth of Judah at the end of verse 35? She stopped having children. That's true. And that's where the praise the Lord comes in, because yes, it's a word that means praise. I might have that note as well. Don't see it immediately, but it's still correct. Now, why would she stop bearing children at this point? They must not have been intimate anymore. Again, 3 times she thought, right. Exactly. That's probably why she stopped bearing, not because she came barren, but she realized it's not going to change my relationship with my husband. So that's why son number 4, she praises the Lord. Instead of keep thinking this is going to change my relationship with my husband. But what's also pointed out in these verses is that Jacob and Rachel themselves could not have children. The text has already said Rachel was barren. So it was Leah who would give to Jacob what would become 4 of his 12 children, due to the fact that Rachel was not able to have children. But it's not till verses 22 through 24 of chapter 30 that Jacob and Rachel would have a child named Joseph, who would become the object of Jacob's affection and loyalty, because it was Joseph that would be the only son of Rachel herself. And that's something we're going to get into next class. Questions or comments before we close out the chapter? Okay. So, if we consider everything in chapter 29, the point here is that Jacob and Rachel were brought together. They were brought together even though they were relatives. They were brought together even though Jacob married Rachel and her sister. Finally, they were brought together even though Jacob and Rachel could not have children. Again, the application, one application at least, is that God does bring people into our lives for a reason. This chapter shows us that there are certain people that God will bring into our lives and do so for a reason. Now, when we read on in the story of Jacob and Rachel, we find that Jacob and Rachel were brought together as a way of God further carrying out his will. Now, the relationship of Jacob and Rachel in these verses is something that would culminate in God bringing about the salvation of the world. Why is that true? One reason is because this relationship between Jacob and Rachel is something that would lead to the birth, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And again, we ask why? Judah. Why is Judah significant in terms of Jesus? That's the line. It is through Judah's line that Jesus would come, this fourth son. Judah means God's praise, or just praise. So, one way God carries out his will is through the relationships we share with others. And the ultimate result is that he is praised. Again, these are just a few applications of this story to us. Anything else? Okay. Well, we'll close with that. Jeremiah, will you close us?